We're going to start. My name is Herman Rosenfeld. I'm with the Socialist Project for forever. It's all relative. What we're going to do is I'm going to chair it, and Brian, why don't you introduce yourself? God forbid you're the main speaker.
Well, okay. I'm Brian, clearly, and I've been everywhere in terms of different memberships, but from the beginning, practically, with the project, I think, or shortly thereafter, it was founded. But you name it, I probably belonged to it at one point or another.
A lot of people on the Toronto left, or socialist left, are like that, aren't they? Aren't we? Okay, so this is a session that we organized for people in the SP and around it to talk about the new right-wing populism. It's elements of it are new, elements of it are not new. We know around the world, certainly around the and not just in the so-called global north, that there's a relatively new form of right-wing ideology and political populism, which echoes some things that have in the past, but is unique in other ways. Here, in fact, in Canada, we always talked about how we're immune to certain kinds of things, but this dates back at least to Mike Harris, and the federal political scene, if it used to be called the progressive conservatives, now were reshaped when the Reform Party took over essentially what was the progressive conservatives. And the form of right-wing populism we see now with it's an appeal to elements of the working class, it's so-called anti-elitism, and its virulent face in the new leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, has really shocked a lot of us. But we know what's happening south of the border, and I was reading articles today about that Adolph Reed sent out about the appeal to segments of the working class, and not just sort of white, more well-off workers, of the arguments that the very, very subtle and disgusting at the same time arguments that Trump and his coterie are making. Brian is going to talk about how that's happening here, what kind of phenomena is it, and what kind of openings do they have into the working class. And I guess the final piece, I guess people will want to ruminate about it collectively, but also what is it that we can particularly contribute to challenge it in terms of things we write, things we say, things we organize, and our particular take on it. So, Brian?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I may not touch on every item Herman mentioned, simply because I want to, what I want to do here is maybe provide a bit of background information which will inform conversation and move that along. I mean, I have no pretense to being an expert on the Canadian radical right. That would be a big undertaking, I found out. But in terms of what Herman mentioned about the shifting ground of the right everywhere, but we're talking about Canada here, I have to go back to the mid-1980s when I worked at the Ontario Legislature. And in that job, I worked for the library, and I would have to work with MPPs from every party, including the Progressive Conservative Party. And looking back on that time, it's really quite striking. Not that I'm trying to romanticize what they were and who they actually represented at all, no. But a very different style, a different culture, a broad tent approach to electoral politics, which included people, names which, given the relative youth here, but a few of you may remember, people like Larry Grossman, Sue Fish, Jim Gordon from Northern Ontario, and Bob Elgee, who was Minister of Labour in the 1970s. They came from an entirely different political milieu. Again, it was, many of you I know hate the term, but the golden age of post-1945 capitalism, and that period of relative, uneven social and economic inclusion. And they reflected that politics. Bob Elgee, to make my final point about that party in that period, Bob Elgee, when he left political life, the Ontario Federation of Labour had a retirement party for him. They never, ever had a retirement party for any conservative of any type, ever. But Bob had shepherded through a number of key labor reforms, including the Occupational Health and Safety Act and different amendments to the Labor Relations Act and the Employment Standards Act. You know, three critical legislative pillars in labor law. And were they ideal? Far from it. But did they move everything forward? Yeah, they definitely did. That would never happen again. And what we might want to think about is the material conditions, the ideational, cultural milieu that has shifted, where that particular form of politics is gone, and gone forever on the right. And much like when we think about social democracy, it's gone. There are people who think it can be retrieved and revived, but it can't. That world in which it emerged and at one point thrived, it's gone. So to begin, in part of my thinking about the issue, I thumbed around my bookshelf, which includes the floor, and found this edition of the Register from 2016. And in the preface, Leo Panich and Greg Albo here wrote that, and I'm paraphrasing, that the far right often finds itself enmeshed in severe contradictions which make that project quite fragile. And they caution, we shouldn't get too alarmed. But yet, we have to pay attention to it, we have to monitor the far right in terms of the different forms it takes, its political practice, and mobilization capacities. And at the end of tonight, I think we're going to be alarmed in terms of what I read, uncovered, different reports about the Canadian right and the far right in particular. But again, in the conclusion of the preface, Leo and Greg write, the key things that we need to think about, and I'm going to try and touch on them quickly, are what is the social base of the far right? What kind of organizational strength and reach does it have? Third, and here's an important part to think about, because it's very real in our context, to what extent does it influence mainstream political parties and the federal and provincial versions of the Conservative Party throughout the country, and conservative opinion among the population generally? And finally, and equally critically, of which there's data, Canadian data, how far has it penetrated state institutions? And I'll be talking a little bit about the military and police in particular, but it goes beyond that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set out the broad context. I'll provide an overview of what I'm calling the mood of the land. What are people thinking? I'm drawing upon opinion surveys, polling data, that kind of thing, which are measuring what are people thinking about the world in which we live, or the country in which we live. Third, I'll unpack the ideological components constituting the Canadian right. And then finally, talk a little bit about, and this is what we can open up into conversation, how the right, the far right, the right, are shaping, informing mainstream politics and political thinking. So in terms of the broad context, we've all been following elections in France, where the National Rally did remarkably well. Italy about to appoint as Prime Minister the leader of a party which claims its heritage back to Mussolini. The upcoming, a year from now, elections in Spain, where the overtly fascist party will be a partner in a right-wing coalition without any doubt. The elections in Sweden, maybe a month ago, where now the far right are in the government. Something that up until a short time ago, all political parties agreed that would never be allowed. And now they are indeed in the government. The ascent of the far right into the mainstream of political life isn't a function of flashy gimmickry. What activates, according to a variety of different bodies of research, what activates the appeal of the right, far right, are these variety of messengers. Think of Poilievre, others maybe we're not familiar with, and their ability to tap into broad economic and cultural anxiety and anger, often incoherent, contradictory, not connected, but that anger and anxiety is tapped into, and a very, like the convoy, a very strange brew of different experiences and issues are then brought on to that platform. Basically, it's voters who feel orphaned by established political parties who they have come to believe do not hear them, therefore do not represent them, and have nothing to offer. A kind of enemy or alienation. But the fundamental definition of populism is it's kind of like the elite only care about themselves. They don't care about people like me. Now, in the European context, the failure of the social democratic left in particular, and its alienation of a large part of its traditional working class electorate, is a big part of the problem. And where working class people have gone politically. And it's also a function partially of the failure to create something to the left of social democracy, which has some appeal. And it's had limited effect, but clearly nowhere near enough. So social democracy, by embracing austerity, particularly after 2008, economic globalization, and integration in the European context in particular, have contributed to that alienation. And the actors which are picking up on that alienation, to a large degree, are, and again, it's highly uneven, are parties of the far right. But I went back and I found a quote from way back in 1988 from Stuart Hall. And he wrote, I think it kind of captures like the mood, the feeling in a broad kind of way. He wrote, in the absence of any fuller mobilization of democratic initiatives, the state is increasingly encountered and experienced by ordinary working people as indeed not a beneficiary, but a powerful bureaucratic imposition. And when you think about one feature of the right and the far right, but the right, the neoliberal right at the moment, the identification of government, the state, as being the problem. Through taxation, go back to 1995 in the Common Sense Revolution. Page one of the Common Sense Revolution Manifesto, it identified the problem very clearly, government. That's the problem confronting you, government. So in the Canadian context, and I've kind of alluded to it, the refashioning of right-wing politics has its own, unique Canadian characteristics, which would be true of anywhere. And that appears to differentiate it from what we observe in Europe, the more xenophobic, racist, kind of overt right-wing characteristics that we see there. It doesn't mean those elements are not present here. They're managed, they're communicated differently, in part. But coming back to this idea of the fear, anxiety, which is broadly being felt, particularly among working class people, think about it this way. Think about the leadership that the Federal Conservative Party just went through. 678,000 people took out a party membership. Now, to put that in relative terms, that means 2.5% of all eligible voters in Canada took out a party membership. Or, another way of thinking about it, 1 in 40 eligible voters in Canada took out a party membership. It's remarkable. right? It's remarkable. A variety of thinkers on the topic of the far right have identified a few key conditions that inform the shifting terrain of the right. And what I'll get into, I'll get into, yeah, these conditions are indeed present in Canada. It's not a French thing, it's not an Italian thing, it's not an American thing. It's indeed a Canadian thing. And those conditions are really, there are four that are identified, and they're going to be all familiar to you. Number one, the reality, and hence the fear and anxiety of a declining middle class, of income stagnation, wage stagnation, and a hyper-concentration of wealth. Secondly, and partly because of number one here, a value shift, undergoing a value shift where liberal and or progressive values are being thrown out in favor of more traditional, social conservative, and illiberal values. Third, a growing belief that the world is becoming more dangerous. And connected to that, a belief, a view, attitude that the country is going in the wrong direction. And then finally, a declining trust in political institutions of every type. Political parties, parliament and legislatures, government institutions, all of that. Like I say, those conditions are very much alive in the Canadian context. So let me kind of like put that in concrete for you. I mentioned the mood. So let me throw some data in front of you capturing the mood. And over a period of time in that shifting mood. And try to remember the four parts which are informing, the shifting terrain. So 20 years ago, 2 out of 3 Canadians who identified, and this is coming out of work where people are self-identifying. So it's not objective, it's people self-identifying. But Canadians who self-identified as being middle class in 20 years ago believed that the quality of life of the generation coming behind them would be better. Okay? We jump forward to 2018, and that had declined to 55%. And if we jump forward to 2022, it's dropped to 35%, right? 37%. About the idea that the world is becoming more volatile, more dangerous. 2003, 56% said, yeah, it's becoming more volatile and dangerous. Jumping forward to 2018, that grew to 70. Trust in government, right? The foundation of kind of the political social contract. Going way back to 1970, kind of like the golden age, or the beginning of the unraveling of the golden age. And we didn't know it. 58% of Canadians said, yeah, I trust government largely or completely. In 2018, that had declined to 35%. And I mentioned direction of the country. 18 years ago, 31% said the country's going in the wrong direction. That was in 2004. In 2019, that number had doubled. 62% said the country's moving in the wrong direction. And for whatever reasons we don't probe into, but clearly a large majority. Now when we look at people who identify as conservative, the numbers get really frightening. In 2011, only 11% of those who identify as conservative supporters said the country was moving in the wrong direction. Got to remember Harper government, that kind of thing in the background, okay? But in 2019, that had grown to nearly 90% of conservative voters saying the country's going in the wrong direction. In Canada, we think that we are multiculturally inclusive and welcoming. Well, one question put was, are there too many visible minorities among the immigrant population? This is actually a very kind of interesting bit of data. Among conservatives in 2013, 47% said, yeah, there are too many. Among the national population in general, holding that view, about 38%. Jumping forward to 2019, again among conservative voters or identifiers, more than 2/3 said there were too many visible minorities among our immigrant population. In terms of the national attitude, not much change at all, about 38-40. And then we'll come to a big one, which I'll run through fairly quickly, about the declining confidence in the ability of government to solve collective problems. You know, that's how we look at government, right? They solve or pretend to solve collective problems. A poll came out in October. I won't name the company. They're kind of like a B range company in terms of the quality of their work, but it's a fairly fresh poll. 31% of those surveyed were not confident that the institutions of the federal government were capable of dealing with the issues confronting the country. And nearly a quarter were actually angry toward the federal government. More than half believed the economy would weaken over the coming year. And overall, the opinion of the ability of the Government of Canada to solve urgent problems like improving healthcare, the economic recovery, the environment, dropped dramatically. And I'm talking by numbers about leading the economic recovery, a 63-point decline in confidence in a very 1 year period of time. So a bit about voting. And we hear from the provincial conservatives, from Poilievre, from Aaron O'Toole before him, a direct appeal to workers. And to what effect, then we ask, do workers of the working class have shifted their electoral allegiance to the conservatives? A number of polls were done, 2013, not during elections per se, 2013, 2015, 2019. And in 2013, and the numbers shift quite dramatically. They begin to move in a very clear direction. 2013, 25% who again self-identified as being working class, identified that they supported the Conservatives. Roughly equal to the number of people who said they would vote for the NDP. We jump forward to 2019, and the numbers change quite dramatically. The number of working class identifiers who say they will now support the Conservatives jumps to 38. And support for the NDP drops to 17. Support for the NDP clearly declining among people identified as working class, and support for the Conservatives clearly trending upward. Now, if we look at the Ontario election of 2022, the one gone by, again, the shift of working class voter loyalty is again measurable, where leading up to the 2022 Ontario election, 37% of people identified as working class identified as Conservative, relative to the NDP, which was 28. And in terms of throwing up more data, union members, it's really interesting. Union members in Ontario, 35% identified as a Conservative voter, compared to 29 for the NDP. So that data draws out a clear picture that the ideological ground is certainly shifting. If the numbers were a little bit narrower, we could maybe have a debate, but the numbers are quite clear. And it's not just one poll, it's a different set of surveys that have found that this kind of trend. So I'm going to turn now to the varieties of Canadian right-wing populism. And we can identify 5, I'm only going to focus on really 2. But we can talk about the fascist right, we can talk about the neoliberal populist right, the Fords, Poilievre, and a handful of other provincial conservative parties. The People's Party of Canada and Bernier, an amalgam, a strange coalition of libertarian and ethno-racial chauvinism. Obviously, social conservatives. And finally, I'm not sure how to characterize them. It's mainly a remnant, an Atlantic Canadian remnant of that pragmatic, market-oriented, but pragmatic, I don't like the word pragmatic, but conservative governments, which are state market-supporting actors, but are, because of the situation of uneven economic development in Atlantic Canada, are in a peculiar position of actually favoring the public sector as a social and economic development tool. You go through Atlantic Canada and the number of people working in the public sectors of every province in Atlantic Canada is quite above the Canadian average. So I'm only going to talk about 2, and I'm already reached the time I wanted to, so I'm going to truncate
Go
this.
through this.
Yeah?
Yeah, go for this.
Yeah, okay. Number 1, the far right, because it's really the more disturbing one, which up until I began poking around, I didn't think much of it. I'm just some, fringy types who aren't that threatening. But I came across a report, a House of Commons report, tabled only in June gone by, which investigated the far right in Canada, in particular the potentially violent far right. And that House of Commons report said that there are 300 or more various radical far right organizations operating in Canada, with memberships ranging from 3 or 4 individuals to a few hundred. Unlike the neoliberal populist variety, they're quite clear about their about their racism, misogyny, anti-immigrant, Islamophobia. These all are part of that landscape, right? We all know that. But again, the report noted that the types of people being attracted to these 300 odd far-right and potentially violent organizations is changing. It's going from largely alienated young men to increasingly middle-aged and older men, and a significant minority of women. So a variety of factors are informing that. And a key one identified by one researcher is what I mentioned earlier in the talk, which was it pandemic, COVID restrictions, all of that? In part, but COVID restrictions, vaccine mandates were nothing more than a vehicle upon which to ride a different agenda. And what one comment made was fundamentally the people who are driven to the far right in Canada are the people who feel ignored, that the predominant political institutions don't recognize them, do not represent them. So that's one thing, that kind of alienation from the entire political regime. Another key element, which is a more frightening one, is the focus on militarization and recruiting military and police personnel. And one of the reports said there's an increasing fascination with guns. And that included a comment about you can go online and look at a whole variety of websites where they demonstrate, the variety of groups will show, like they show it, the weapons that they have collected and paramilitary training that they are undertaking. One group in particular is actually made entirely up of former members of the Canadian military. And this one group, that's all they want. These are people who have combat training, some of whom were in Afghanistan, but they know how to engage militarily. A number of organizations, like the one I mentioned, only recruit from the Canadian military. But in addition to that, another tactic or strategy is actually to have members join the Canadian military to obtain that kind of training, and then teach others. So that's the far right. And now, I keep on saying briefly, I'll turn to the more conventional neoliberal populism of Ford, Poilievre, and then the odd amalgam of the People's Party of Canada. And to kind of truncate it, make it real short, some have identified a phenomenon which they're calling, in academic terms, racial realignment. And this comes out particularly in the Ford phenomenon, but not exclusively, but largely, where support for Doug Ford is actually quite high among visible minorities and people whose economic prospects are in fact measurably declining. And the Ford brand, the Ford Nation brand, and to some degree Poilievre, is to communicate or to diminish the overtly, directly racist rhetoric or attack lines you hear from Bernier and the PPC. And if you remember when the PPC got launched, Bernier had a very public anti-immigration campaign. That was sort of the anchor of the PPC in that initial campaign, which was anti-immigration. But that is something which you don't find in the neoliberal populist messaging and politics, which is more about economic freedom, individual aspiration, minimal government. And very finally, to wrap it up, what are the implications for Canadian mainstream politics? Well, kind of touching upon it already, a Hungarian researcher said, by becoming involved in the political mainstream, that becomes the method by which you become legitimate and you can reach out to much larger, potentially larger political audience. And they do that by taking a far-right politics, soften the image, much like we've watched in Italy, to some degree, but yet maintain the program that they began with initially, to some degree or another. So additional implications, the final comment will be the penetration. The Washington Post actually had an article about a year ago on the degree to which the far right has infiltrated the federal Conservative Party and provincial parties. It was not empirical, but the observation made was that the federal and a variety of provincial political Conservative parties in Canada knew it and were unwilling or unable to do anything to eject those movements, those people from the party. And that has huge implications for the mainstream if you begin thinking about elections and election outcomes and imagining Poilievre forming a government. And then you think about the people who win nominations, become cabinet ministers, hire people in at hundreds, many hundreds of staff jobs, and then equally importantly, having the power to make critical appointments to key positions within the Canadian state. Military, intelligence, trade, etc. And when you begin adding all that up, it becomes, to take what Leo and Greg wrote back in 2016, alarming. And I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry for going on too long.